So you can see the slides, and if I write, you can see the writing. Okay, good. Okay, so those, I don't know how many people are right now here, but there should be. So all of you, as I said, unless you have some really strong reasons, please keep your cameras on. It's okay to have virtual background if you don't want me to see your room. I have my room. I think I hate the Zoom virtual background. It makes my face sort of melt away once in a while. So I just have my real room. But I think it's supposed to be a seminar, so we would like to have it as a seminar. I actually never ran a seminar on Zoom. In fact, I never did a seminar per se for especially undergrads. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So keep your cameras on. And as I'll say in a minute, the idea about muting is actually, I mean, I'm actually, if you are in a reasonably non-noisy place, you should just keep your mics should also be on. That's how the classes are, right? We essentially just avoid making noises and then we listen to each other. So, and since you are in your homes and your kid sister or kid brother may be making lots of noises, in those cases, yeah, it's fine. You can, unmute yourself and unmute. But I'd like to make this as lively as possible so that it's not just me talking. And right now, I have in front of me all of you. I have a grid of all of you guys. And then on this side is my slides, but I also have my iPad on which actually I'll be using the slides. So that's the setup. Okay. So this is the invitation to AI, the seminar thing that we are trying. So some administrative things. There are, the last I checked, 22 students enrolled, and it's a very eclectic and diverse, I guess, set of people, which is exactly what I was hoping for. There were 7 CS majors, 4 mechanical engineering, 4 biosci and biochemistry, 2 math, 2 philosophy ethics, 2 business economics, and 1 health medical. Okay. In some sense, actually, the fact that so many different area people showed up for something called Invitation to AI makes you realize how AI has sort of caught people's attention quite a bit. If I just said invitation to cybersecurity or invitation to boring databases, I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have gotten many of you to show up. Okay. In terms of seniority, actually, it's 10 freshmen, 7 sophomores, 3 juniors, 1 senior. Okay, so freshmen among you, actually, as I said in one of the mails I may have sent to you guys, actually, I'm not supposed to be teaching this semester. I'm off teaching. And my wife basically was teaching serious course for electrical engineering. And at some point of time, A, I started missing teaching, and B, I thought it's a rather strange semester for people to start their first year of college, right? I mean, honestly, many of you thought all sorts of fun stuff will be happening in the first year. You didn't quite think this is how the semester is going to be turning out. And so I thought maybe we will try doing this. And so in fact, I started, I asked the honors college after the semester started.
Well,
that's how.
Yeah. So when you
somebody is talking at the same time while their mic is on. You might want to mute in that case. Okay. And so so they basically decided to set this up for freshman B.
Something wider because I thought something.
I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I might just.
I think that was the person who was having some trouble with their audio, so they might have.
Oh, okay.
Leave computer audio?
No, we're not supposed to leave.
Okay.
Unmute people too, right?
Oh shoot.
No, actually who is this person then? Oh, there's actually a chat window too. Yeah, let's try to see if we can first get the technical problems dealt with, maybe. Okay. Okay, that's fine. Now they seem to be fine. Okay, we'll see. I'll keep this chat window here just in case. It is actually hard for me to look at the chat window while talking to you, but I'll try. In fact, if there is things to be said, just raise your hand because I can see your faces and I'll be able to see your hand too. And then I'll just, unmute yourself and talk, when you just think. So anyway, so that's the story regarding why this course came to be. And I actually never did a freshman seminar, but I thought this might be something we'll try what happens. And I didn't really expect anybody to show up because it's session B and you guys already took enough courses. But normally freshmen are crazy enough to do something like this. After a while you grow old and then you realize that the point of school is basically to do the least amount of work and get out. But you still are full of idealism in the first year, I guess. So, thank you for showing up. So anyway, so I'm really doing it for the freshmen. And then so feel free to, so this was going to be pitched towards them. And I think it's kind of interesting to everybody. I would believe so. But you should feel free to pitch in, participate in the discussions, etc., and not be worried about the fact that there are slightly more senior-ish people in the class. Okay. And then, as I said, this is going to be run as a seminar style class. Basically, you all are supposed to have read the conversation starter for today, which was that little article that I sent you. And then I will try doing some overview presentation every day, but it's not meant to be a lecture. So you should stop me pretty much anytime. And the more you stop, the more it's going to be a seminar. I've been teaching for like God knows how long. And so if you leave me, I will talk for 18 hours and won't really, I also got my coffee, so, I can do that. But it's not really going to be a seminar. It's going to be a lecture in that case. So feel free to stop me. And then unlike normal classes where there is like a very strict syllabus and there is some interest in making sure that we tick all the syllabus things, here it's to some extent, where the discussions go. And that's hopefully what you're also doing. And this is a 1 credit course. And you might get a lot more than 1 credit, but it's really up to you as to how you use the time. So as I said, the discussion should be both interleaved with my presentation and after it. For the first day, just since I'm not completely sure how these things will work out, I do have enough. I'll always have more than enough presentation material to cover the time. That's not the issue. So for the first day also I have that. But you should feel free to stop me when you have questions. And yeah. And then one other thing that I'll make it clearer is after each class, you notice that we all have this piazza. The very fact that you showed up means that there's a piazza because that's the only place where the Zoom link was posted as far as and I think I also put it on the canvas later. So on Piazza, there is this nice facility where instructor can give a question and the students can write a collective answer. It's like a Wikipedia page. Okay, so you write something, somebody else overwrites you. Rather than use that for some kind of a Trump biography, we can actually use it as a set of notes for what happened in the class that day. Okay, different people catch different points and you can either try to correct what other people have written or you could add your own pieces, and it's just like Wikipedia style. So you can, and there's a history. So I do know who actually edited it. And so that sort of, if you have never edited anything after 7 classes, I believe, this semester, then I think you haven't taken it seriously. But in general, that will also stay as some sort of a written account of things that got discussed. In addition, of course, to any slides I use, I'll put up on the Piazza, and you'll have those too. Okay. And then grading, I mean, it's more supposed to be a seminar. I'm not really focusing on strict grading criteria, but I will use letter grades just so that people take it seriously. And that taking it seriously essentially means participating seriously, okay, rather than sleeping through it. That's really what it is going to be. So that's what, my view of what we're going to do this 7 classes. And then this I already mentioned, administrative part, one of the second part basically, which is during the classes, you should keep your cameras on by default as you are doing. And then, I will be sharing slides like I'm doing right now. And as I said, you should keep your mics unmuted unless you're forced to be dialing in from a noisy place. In general, getting used to having mics unmuted makes you take the class seriously. Okay, we all have done Zooms. Okay, you're not the first guys to have figured out that I can have the camera on, but I'll be talking to my friend on the side. First of all, I can see your lip movement because I'm making you put on the camera. But secondly, it's serious. I'm not making this up. Like 2 days back, New York Times has this article saying how to make remote learning work, unmute yourself. Right? In normal classes, there are many things that are, some people actually hated normal classes. Maybe one of you are one of them, but some people like them. Zoom-based classes don't have to be the worst scenario. They can actually have the best of both worlds. You can sit where you are. I think at least one person is nicely in a car. I can see, that's very nice. The important thing is just like in class where you discipline yourself to follow what's going on as against multitask at the same time. Here, unmuting yourself and keeping that in the back of your mind, will actually make you pay attention because there's less temptation to spend other time. I'm like a big believer that in this day and age where everything is available, one click away, all that you have to offer to learn something is your discipline. That's it, okay? And it's not that there isn't all this stuff plus more available on web, on YouTube, on every possible different things. What you're bringing right now is your attention, okay? And if you don't use that, then it's just a letter on your, like a name on your transcript, and it doesn't help much. Okay, so anyway, that's all I have to say regarding the class administrative thing itself. Before I go into doing some actual discussion of some front material for the class, are there any questions, any administrative-ish questions that anybody has? Unmute yourself and ask if you have any questions.
I was just wondering if you're going to be doing a plus-minus system or just straight letter grades.
I haven't decided. I actually, when I normally teach classes, I use plus minuses. Okay, and so I can do plus minus, and it's basically I haven't decided that I won't use them. But as I said, this is again more for. I would think that it would be hard to make very fine grading distinctions. So I would think that it's more a question of you have to convince me that, look, please give me a bad grade. Because I've decided to take a session B course as if I didn't have enough things to do in my life. And for 1 credit, I just wanted to do it to kind of, rub you the wrong way. And then if you do that, then, you basically get your wish. But otherwise, I don't have any real reason to punish anybody. Okay. But I will reserve my right to give plus minuses just in case. There may be some people who may well be doing above and beyond, in every class and in every seminar, and then, that should be allowed. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Okay, so what I am going to do is basically, walk you through essentially some version of that article, background version of that article that you read. And then so if you have actually questions about that article, as I'm talking about those parts, you can raise them. And that's how, these things will start. So a little bit of a background. So starting from the fact that I have been in this area of, in area called artificial intelligence, at least since 1983. In fact, before that, because this was my bachelor's thesis at IIT Madras, which is an engineering school in India. And you'll notice that this thing says some experiments in isolated word speech recognition for confusable vocabulary. So there are words that sound similar to each other, and you're trying to recognize which word was actually spoken. And so this was a sort of a signal processing work. In fact, one of the interesting things is I was doing this as signal processing. How many of you, actually it's surprising that I didn't get anybody in electrical engineering, from electrical engineering. But those of you who do electrical engineering will wind up doing signal processing. And one of the things that happened is that a lot of signal processing and a lot of machine learning parts have sort of fused together. A lot of speech recognition, which used to be done in electrical engineering, is now just done as machine learning. And we'll kind of figure out why that happened to some extent. But anyway, so that was the background. And in '83 at that time, essentially, when this was fun stuff to do, because I think, in fact, nobody grows up saying, I want to grow up to be a database person. I feel sorry for them if there are such people. And I'm even more sorry if they want to grow up to be a software engineer. But I think people tend to want to grow up to be firemen, firewomen, plus also AI people, because it's like a beautiful area. It's like the idea of one of the things that we think sets us apart from all the living things is our level of intelligence, human intelligence. And we don't quite understand the basis for it. And we do it, but we don't exactly know how we are able to perceive the world, how we are able to reason about what's happening in the world. I mean, if you think about it, it's sort of mind-blowing that, unless you believe in one of these bad theories of somebody sat down and made the entire world for you in about 6 to 15 days, the fact that we just sort of evolved to this point and we had some sense, using our intelligence, we figured out how the world works at the level we are doing, is kind of mind-blowing, right? And so we want to understand, to some extent, the origins of intelligence. And in fact, I think I used to have this thing somewhere else, that there are only really 3 deep questions left in the world, right? Which is origin of the universe, origin of life, nature of intelligence. And you notice there is no 4th question called nature of databases. These are like the big questions that we see in our lives. And so it's not surprising that people will fall for one of them. I know that many of you are doing biology. I don't know that I have anybody from cosmology, but I mean, that's also one of the things that, catches people's attention. These are big questions in life. And so anyway, the interesting part is that when I was a grad student, there was nowhere near the kind of hype that you see about AI. Some crazy people will fall for some things, and I was one of them, but mostly there was this huge pushback saying, are you guys crazy? Why even thinking of a discipline called artificial intelligence? Their computers can show intelligent behavior. Computer artifacts can show intelligent behavior. In fact, do any of you guys recognize that name, Roger Penrose? Roger Penrose was on news, if nothing else. Roger Penrose was in news last week, because he got a Nobel Prize in physics. He was one of the guys who got the Nobel Prize in physics. Roger Penrose and a bunch of British physicists, after writing their own other papers on black hole theories and so on and so forth, have decided, in fact, Roger Penrose found a late life calling in talking about impossibility of artificial intelligence. So he would write all these books. This is one of the books, there are like 3 or 4 other books on why AI as a discipline is not going to go anywhere. It is theoretically impossible, blah, 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 lots and lots of stuff, okay? If anything, actually people would sort of talk about why this won't work and this can't work. And then certainly there was no industrial interest, because I'm sure some of you philosophy majors would be feeling the same thing. Philosophy is like the most important question. How come there aren't any philosophy jobs, job openings left, right, and center? Basically there was no industry in philosophy, okay? Similarly, there was no industry in AI as much at that point of time, okay? This was my undergraduate, and then I was crazy enough to do grad study in the same area. And now you know more of what's going on right now because you showed up. I mean, you're in the first year and you heard of AI somehow. How many of you have heard of NP hardness? How many of you have heard of undecidability theorem? How many of you have heard of halting problem? All those names, NP hardness, undecidability, halting problem, especially these two, this is the bedrock of computer science. Okay, and in fact, these two come from a guy called Turing, Alan Turing. Some of you may have seen Imitation Game. If you haven't already heard of him, you may have seen the movie Imitation Game. It was it's a movie based on his life. He's just an most influential scientist in computer science. Strangely enough, he was also a very influential scientist for artificial intelligence, which is kind of connected to AI, but in fact, he was the guy who wrote one of the first papers on can machines think in 1950. Okay, how many of you heard of Turing Test? Anybody heard of Turing Test? Okay, so Turing Test, Alan Turing, essentially, when he wrote this paper, Can Machines Think, which is a tightly argued philosophical paper to some extent, because they had barely any machines. I mean, he just about rigged up this Enigma machine to break the code of the Nazi Germany that was being used. But then he was realizing the potential of computers, and he started thinking at some point of time, you can say everything is a computation. And so to the extent you can talk about intelligence as a computation, can we get machines to show intelligent behavior? Okay, and then the question, of course, is suppose they were to show it, how will I know that they showed it? Okay, and then so he came up with a test. It has lots of problems, but it was interesting that in 1950s, this guy was sitting around coming up with, how would I know if I reached my goal? It's very important for all of you. If you set yourself a goal, you need to have a termination condition. How do I know that I reached the goal versus I just passed it by? Okay, and so he set himself this goal, and he set himself this test called Turing Test, and which basically sort of goes along these lines that a human is talking to something behind a curtain. That thing behind a curtain can be another human, can be a computer, and they're quote unquote talking by teletype, because that's something that the machine as well as human can do. And the question then is, after a bunch of conversation with this entity on the other side of the curtain, if the human says, I'm talking to a human, and many humans say this, and it turns out that the thing behind the curtain actually is a machine, then for all intents and purposes, you have said that the only people who seem to care so much about intelligence, which is humans, can't tell the difference between this computer artifact and humans. And so then I would say that we are able to actually reach, get a computer artifact that has human level intelligence. So this was his idea originally. There are all sorts of interesting digressions around this. There are all sorts of problems with actually Turing test. Sometimes Turing test turns out to tell more about what we think intelligence is, what we think human versus non-human is, than what really intelligence is. Okay, because there's no objective definition. So there was a cheap imitation of Turing test called Loebner test. Some Boston millionaire started this test for a while back in like 2000s, 90s timeframe, where he would essentially do this Turing test. Okay, so people can, then that's when this was the chatbot time. People will come up with chatbots, they'll put it on the side, and then the humans, random Bostonians will go and talk to these chatbots versus humans. Of course, if you tell them beforehand that everything behind the curtain is a machine, then there's no point, right? Obviously, they sort of decide to either put a machine or a human. And depending on the luck of the draw, you might get a human talking to you or a machine talking to you. And what they'll do is they'll see what people said as the identity of the thing they talk to. Is it a machine or a human? And interestingly enough, just to get you to see the silliness of this sometimes, there was this one, and so the Loebner test did not make open-ended conversations. Instead, they said each window will have a specific topic, and you can have conversations on that topic with whatever is behind that window. Do you see what I'm saying? We humans obviously can have open-ended conversations. This is class, so we tend to talk about class, but then randomly I bring up some other thing. You will still sort of go with the flow. And in particular, if you're just talking one-on-one, conversation topics will change. We are able to do that. But since that was harder for chatbots, they said at least topics. And there was one particular case where there was this Shakespearean expert. The one window said Shakespearean expert. And it turned out that there was actually a human, some crazy Shakespeare nerd sitting behind the window. And that guy knew way too much about Shakespeare, way too much. And everybody who talked to this thing behind the window, the Bostonians, decided nobody with a real life would be so crazy as to know so much about a dead guy. And so they all said, this is clearly a machine. And so this was a Turing test which went on its face. Instead of saying the machine was human, we said human was machine, because we tend to think that, we have all these crazy presuppositions as to what being human means, and what being intelligent means, and what being human-like intelligence means, okay? So actually Turing test has its own problems, but it's still, as I said, it's very interesting that in 1950s, Turing was thinking about these kinds of ideas. And actually, when I came to this slide, I actually wanted to point out to you that some of the other things that Turing did, which are the bedrock of computer science, you never heard of them. Many of you are freshmen, and some of you are not in computer science. But obviously you didn't hear of these important concepts in computer science, but you heard about AI. You heard about, some of you even heard about Turing test. That sort of tells you the level to which AI has caught popular imagination. If people who are somewhat, university, college going like people are already aware of AI, you can imagine, and then they have their own some ideas, you can imagine what is happening outside world, where everybody actually tries to, it turns out that everybody is an expert in AI now, suddenly. And by the way, I have a Twitter account, and, mostly I use to post jokes about AI. And one of the things I say that the demand for AI experts with no AI background has never been greater, right? Everybody can just call themselves an AI expert. You guys now right away. You can say honors 294 invitation to AI. You are all AI experts. Essentially, you are already way ahead of most other people. So that is something that has changed quite a bit from the time when I was in AI and I started working as a professor. Even as a faculty member, my rest of the faculty members in CS department will look at me and say, so, poor Rao doesn't really get databases, doesn't really get software engineering. He's stuck with this sort of, wishy-washy stuff like AI. Now I find out that they have always been doing AI, apparently. They just forgot to mention it to anybody. And in fact, you will notice that many STEM professors have been doing AI. This is like, there's this classic thing that success has many parents, failure is an orphan. Okay, so right now, currently AI somehow became successful. And so the problem the reason I brought this slide up is this guy is JBS Haldane. Those of you who are from biology, have you heard of JBS Haldane's name? Very interesting character. Look up Wikipedia after the fact. He did lots of interesting work in population genetics and biology, etc. And one of these quotes attributed to him is, the universe is not only queerer than we suppose, but queerer than we can suppose. Which is actually a kind of a very interesting point, that even imagination, our imaginations themselves are limited. There's no real reason as to why whatever intelligence we have, we were able to make sense of what's going on in the world. And, parts that we did understand, we were able to exploit quite a bit. But he was essentially saying that, really universe is not only queerer than you suppose, it is queerer than you can suppose. You actually may well be limited by your intelligence, human intelligence in general. And I actually think of this when I think of the crazy hype around AI of late. AI is not only bigger than you suppose, it's bigger than apparently you can suppose. So some of the strange things that have come up, that have been said about AI, Andrew Ng basically called AI the new electricity. Sundar Pichai, who is, Google head, Google CEO now, he called AI bigger than fire and electricity. Lewandowski, by the way, there's a lot of name dropping that goes on in this thing. I mean, it's almost like, shows like Gilmore Girls. It's all about cultural references. You should keep track of all these because that's part of, what you might get out of it. How many of you know Lewandowski, Tony Lewandowski? He's the guy who essentially, he's a brilliant guy who was doing self-driving cars for Waymo. Before Waymo and self-driving cars started, there was a self-driving car competition by DARPA, and everybody else was doing cars that are self-driving. And Tony Lewandowski was crazy enough to do self-driving motorcycle. It's crazy, right? Because at least car won't fall off. It has 4 wheels. You don't need to worry about the damn balance. Okay, like you don't have enough problems in the world when you're doing autonomous driving. He wanted to do self-driving motorcycle. He's a brilliant guy. Unfortunately, of course, he made some terrible life choices, such as, copying a few things from Waymo and then, going to Uber and giving them that. And he actually has gone to jail now. But in between, he was going around talking about AI being a god. It's like a new religion almost. And then everything, this is already dated. Everything around you has AI embedded in it. My favorite thing for a while has been the smart electronic toothbrush that provides real-time feedback to improve brushing habits and help prevent problems before they start. You can always add 15 units of AI to anything you are trying to do, and currently it's the flavor of the day. So that sort of makes it more marketable, right? And then there is this other doomsayers, right? Which is AI. Elon Musk is like a great character who knows a lot, but also claims to know a lot more than he knows, okay, which is kind of sad. I mean, there are other people, where they don't know anything and they claim that they know everything. Elon is more complex case because he does know a lot, but he also claims to have expertise in everything. And so then in this case, he was into AI being a bigger threat than North Korea, and he'll start the Third World War. And Stephen Hawking, remember we were talking about Roger Penrose, who was this English physicist. Stephen Hawking is another English physicist. And, and he was basically saying AI could be the worst event in the history of civilization. And people like Stephen Hawking say that, essentially, I actually remember as a joke that back in 2014, I was in Australia, and then I basically got elected to be the president of this AAAI, which is this AI association. And up until then, being a president of AI didn't mean much because it's a small area and you do it for academic reasons. And about a few days later, in September of that year, Elon Musk essentially came out with this thing that the thing that keeps him awake in the nights is AI, because of the problems it can cause. And then a few days later, Stephen Hawking says AI could be the worst event in the history of the world. And then that's that. After that, essentially, there is all the positive hype, all the negative hype. Clearly, things have gone crazy, in terms of the over coverage of AI. And most of the coverage is essentially clueless. And my hope is that by our discussions here, you'll at least go a few levels deeper in terms of understanding what the issues are. And then of course, at some point of time, you should take technical courses, which involve actually you doing hands-on programming and so on. Maybe some of you will wind up taking Intro to AI that I teach. But that is a lot more depth-oriented thing. This is, more of a breadth-oriented introduction to AI. Okay, so actually, this was this other bunch of things that I had. Again, you are probably the last of the majors. None of you are AI majors, which is very sad, right? Because MIT, there's actually a university for AI that United Arab Emirates has started, University for AI. Then MIT has just a college for AI. Carnegie Mellon has an undergraduate degree in AI. China has a high school textbook for AI. India introduced AI in 10th grade. So you're already way too late. You're only thinking of AI in your freshman year. So this is actually why, with tongue firmly in cheek, we started this program called In Utero AI at ASU, where you get to learn AI before you are born. That way you are really good to go in terms of competing with all these other overeager viewers who are doing AI in the high school, elementary school, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. It's kind of useful to keep the hype in the back of mind. So what I want to do now is say a few things. By the way, at any point of these times, raise your hand. I mean, I know there's not much to ask about jokes, but if there's any questions, raise your hand and I'll stop and we'll talk, okay? So let's start with some kind of a definition for AI. Hard to give a definition in general for fields, but I'll give you two levels of definitions. One is an informal definition, which is saying getting machines to do things that when done by humans would be considered intelligent behavior. You see what I'm saying? It's like, unfortunately or fortunately, intelligence, like beauty, I guess, is in the eyes of the beholder. And it is typically a moving target, okay? But that's a reasonable thing about why something is AI versus, some other area. So these are things that people are able to do that you never saw machines doing it, and now they're able to do them. And so you consider that essentially getting non-human artifacts to do human-like behavior is an informal definition of AI. Okay, now that is an interesting reason. You know, it's as good as it's not particularly a completely wishy-washy definition, because, for example, you don't expect humans to add up 18,000 rows of numbers. That the machine is doing it is not necessarily going to make you think that the machine is intelligent. The first time around, computers were able to add a few numbers together. Until then, they were not able to. That was a sign of intelligence, because people can do it, computers are able to do it. Now computers have gone, taken that ultra scale, and you're no longer impressed. You're not comparing yourself to computers in terms of your really ridiculously low quality ability to multiply large numbers together in microseconds. Okay, but on the other hand, things like essentially many other things like playing games, having a conversation, recognizing things in the world, these are things that people do, you do all the time, but you never saw any AI artifact, any computer artifacts doing it, and getting them to do that is, you can think of that as a definition of AI. Okay, that's like an informal definition. A more formal definition, that is what we use in Intro to AI class, is technically it is designing an intelligent agent. Okay, an intelligent agent essentially is reacting with an environment. It's working in an environment. It has a bunch of actions that it can do, and when it is doing these actions, it is getting sometimes, it has some goals that it might want to achieve. When it achieves those goals, it gets rewards, some brownie points. And a good intelligent agent is one that is essentially increasing the number of brownie points it gets. That's what you guys are doing, by the way. You have decided that you want to achieve various things in your life. And whenever you achieve, bucket lists are typically talked about when you have only a couple of years left in life. But really, all life is a big, long bucket list. And you are essentially trying to achieve intermediate things as well as some goals after that and so on. And how do you decide that one performance of one human is supposedly better or worse than some other person? It's basically this question of rewards that they're able to accumulate, and you can talk about the total rewards they accumulate. You can talk about average rate in which their rewards are being accumulated. Okay, so intelligent agent design will be getting an agent working in an environment to perform in a way to maximize its return in the reward. So this looks much drier definition than the first one, which just says intelligence is what intelligence is, which is basically a nice circular definition. Both are essentially kind of, first starting points. As I said in Intro to AI, this is the definition we go with, and we talk about then, the question is, if there is a computer program which has, to make changes to the environment, it needs to have effectors. Okay, like for example, I lifted this microphone, that's like I have an effector called hand, I can lift things. Okay, and I also need to see what is happening in the environment. I need to have sensors, my ears, my nose, my mouth to figure out the taste, for example. So these are all the sensors. So sensors are used by the agent to get the state of the environment, and the effectors are used by the agent to change the state of the environment. Okay, and the question then is, what is in your control as an intelligent agent is what actions you will do next. And figuring out the actions that you will do next in such a way that you will get. And so when the environment is in different configurations, you will get some kinds of rewards, when that environment is in various configurations. So if you're playing like Atari games or some video games, when the game environment reaches certain configurations, you get some points. So you can think of that essentially as, you know, a more general version of that. And this rewards is what you're trying to maximize. And we can go a lot more into technical detail about models for those kinds of agents, but really much of AI is figuring out what should go into this black box, such that this black box, which has effectors going out and sensors coming in, is able to improve its performance metric in the world. And then humans are one such black box. And then you would say that a particular agent is better than human or worse than human in certain tasks based on the, you know, the goal metric, that the rewards that they're able to get. Okay, so that's it's a drier definition, but it is something that you can hopefully implement. This, on the other hand, is a non-operational definition. Okay, but both are actually useful to keep in mind. Any questions on that as far as the definition of what AI is supposed to be? Okay. So let's see, I don't know why that came. Actually, this should have come earlier. I don't want to complain too much about the hype of AI because, as I said, for most of my life, people used to make fun of me for doing AI. Now I get to be on TV, I get to be in the Roosevelt room, even though unfortunately the guy in the Oval Office is not my friend, and, you know, various also of other things. So all that fun is there. And actually, at one point of time, I even made this MAGA hat. It's the MAGA hat, I guess. Make AI great again, because much of this, as I said, after 2014, when I became the AAAI president, is when all of this happened. So being a modest person, I take all credit for things that I actually didn't do, as long as they help my case. Anyway, so that was just the wrong order. But going back to the intelligence definitions, the thing that I want you to, so we talked about this definition of AI. This definition is basically like a working definition that we'll use right now. And but the second thing that would be more useful, and I think that's what was being discussed in that article that you read, is in terms of trying to make these kinds of intelligent agents, in terms of trying to get machines to show behaviors that are human-like intelligent behaviors, it's interesting to note the way human kids show these intelligent behaviors and how AI systems showed those intelligent behaviors. Because it actually explains a whole bunch of things in terms of why certain kinds of developments happened in AI now as against before, okay? The thing that I was talking about is that, you know, when kids come into the world, I mean, you know, you probably don't remember what you were doing as a kid. Actually, it's like a very strange thing. One of the things that is interesting about AI in general, of course, is it's hard to talk about the field without talking about human intelligence, without thinking about human intelligence. That's why some of you are from biology, some of you probably, I think, mentioned neuroscience, etc. These things are connected, but not exactly the same. And there are all sorts of very interesting puzzles. For example, did any of you think of why is it that we forget our early childhood memories? I don't know. I mean, like, obviously you don't remember being born. I mean, unless you are like one of these particularly brilliant people, and you probably don't remember what happened in the first 2-3 years of your life. After that, if you start continually forgetting, they'll say you have Alzheimer's and they'll put you in some kind of a, you know, this thing. Nobody is considered Alzheimer's because they didn't remember what happened in their first 3 years of life. Okay. But if you forget what happened, you know, in your 10th grade onwards, for example, that's kind of, there are no, you know, get out of jail sheets there, because you essentially, your memory isn't working as supposed to be. Anyway, so even though you may not remember what you were doing when you first came into this world, you have seen other kids, right? And so typically we see that kids come into this world, the things that they do, perceptual intelligence first. They start recognizing people's faces. There is, you know, enough research saying that we are like hardwired to recognize faces. This is exactly why we see Mother Mary on a burnt toast. And if you are from other cultures, you see your God on the burnt toast. Burnt toast is full of gods, whichever God you want to see. And the gods will always be human faces, because evolutionarily, we just have this ability to consider everything to look like a face. Okay, so they start doing perceptual intelligence. They start recognizing, their mother's face. Sometimes they also recognize their father's face, but typically they recognize their mother's face first. And then they start having this intelligence in physical manipulation. Mental manipulation is something that will get it very quickly, but originally physical manipulation. Like I like this picture of this kid. One time, this was a little kid of one of my wife's grad student's daughter, and we went for lunch, and this kid was picking up things with her little fingers, exquisite grasping. Okay, there are no robots right now which can do what that kid is doing. Amazon would pay you billions of dollars if you can mass produce these kids. You understand what I'm saying? Right? You have these huge, big robots you try to hold, clumsily. They do not know how to manipulate things at all very well. Okay, that's what kids do when they first come. You don't get a badge for it. Nobody ever says, what a good grasper you are. But really you should have been. Those kids, if only they knew how to speak, they will tell their mom and pop, don't wait until I start doing multiplication and give me badges. Multiplication, any stupid computer can do. What I'm doing, this grasping, no stupid computer can do. Okay, so they do that. Then they do perception. Of course, they look at the people's faces. They have this emotional intelligence. First of all, this other idea about this is intelligence is not one thing. It's a many-faceted thing. We have all these names, for example, emotional intelligence, showing and recognizing emotional responses from others. Okay, do you really believe, here's another of these puzzles. Do you really believe that kids understand jokes? Kids being infants. Why do they laugh? It's completely evolution screwing around with us, right? If they laugh, we feel good and we'll give them more stuff. And a churlish kid basically doesn't get much food. And so churlish kids, evolution sort of weeded them out. And so you only have mostly churlish older people, because by that time it's harder to kind of not feed them. But churlish kids, parents don't like them, right? Unfortunately, right? So emotional intelligence is the ability to cry sometimes, once in a while, show some happy face, etc. These things, they figure this out very quickly. They do then social and communicative intelligence. Kids know how to deal with other kids. Some are bully kids, they push each other out, and some are kids who will try to steal stuff from the other kids, all sorts of fun things they learn. As part of this communication is when they start doing actual language, human language, what we consider human language. Much of social intelligence requires a theory of mind. Theory of mind is this idea that when I'm talking to you, you have your own mind, and what I believe is not necessarily believed by you. You have your own intentions, beliefs, desires. I have my own intentions, beliefs, and desires, and I can't just ramrod my interests onto you. If I want you to stay interested in having a conversation with me or collaborating with me, I need to reason about your mental models. We do this all the time. This is what we typically call people skills. Okay, you normally never get a job if you wind up going for a Google or a Microsoft interview. They don't ask any people skills questions. Nobody gets a job because they have people skills. They keep one because they have people skills, unless they're engineers, in which case they don't have to talk to anybody, so they don't need people skills, right? But mostly people skills are the ability to deal with each other. In fact, there's this whole idea that evolutionarily our brain size is unreasonably large for what we need to do. Evolutionarily speaking, because evolutionarily nobody thought you will need to take invitation to AI course, right? And so all they were interested in is you should just run away from the tigers or the lions and be able to pick some fruits and eat. How big a brain do you need for that? Do you see what I'm saying? And in fact, we're extremely bad at, we are in fact very bad compared to most animals in terms of all these physical skills. We are not the fastest anything. We are not the tallest anything. We're not the heaviest anything, although, during the COVID times, we are trying to be heavier and heavier. Mostly, we're still not the heaviest anything, right? Right? And yet, why did we have this crazy big brain? And in fact, one of the hypotheses that, evolutionary biologists have is that our brains increased in size to deal with each other. It's the social intelligence that led to the increase in brain size. How many of you have read or heard of Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari? Anybody? There you go, good. Beautiful book, you should read that. In fact, he points out in what sense we are not the only intelligent things on earth, right? I mean, many animals are pretty darn intelligent. In fact, many animals have better perceptual abilities. Many animals have better manipulation abilities. The one thing that we have is social intelligence. And so in fact, Sapiens basically makes this argument that much of human civilization is shared imaginations. Religion, shared imagination. Government, shared imagination. There's no physical thing called government. We just all agreed for a set of rules. We bought into it. Religion, you buy into it. Much of human civilization is essentially this ability to kind of make social compacts for which you need social intelligence. Okay. And then finally, you get to the point called cognitive or reasoning intelligence, which is what we typically think of when we say intelligence. Right? In schools, nobody asks you, I mean, except maybe in sports of some kinds, nobody checks your perceptual intelligence. Nobody really checks your emotional intelligence. You don't get any A grade for emotional intelligence. You get mostly your grades for this cognitive and reasoning intelligence. The kind of things that you get tested on SATs. And these are more declarative and consciously accessible parts of our knowledge, which is why I get to ask you questions on exams. And then you will be able to answer those questions. So actually, I mentioned this very interesting point, which also was in that thing, tacit versus conscious, tacit versus explicit knowledge. A bunch of things that you do without knowing how you do it. A bunch of things you do knowing how you do it. Do you see what I'm saying? And the explicit knowledge tasks typically are the ones you get tested on, what has been called the cognitive intelligence. But of course, it is possible that something when originally you figure out how to multiply numbers, and after doing it enough number of times, you don't do 9 times 7 by using your fingers anymore. You very quickly get the answer because you have taken explicit knowledge and compiled it into tacit behavior. Some things that you learn explicitly, you can compile into tacit behavior, but they were originally rooted in explicit knowledge. Many other things that you do tacitly, you don't know how you do it, like at all. Like for example, I'm seeing your faces. After a while, I'll be able to say, you are this person, etc. How did I do that? How do you look at a picture and say, this is a dog? How do you swim? For example, I remember there was a time, now we are back into that sort of thing, but I mean, there was this time when these MOOCs were there, where massive online courses, and people like me were very worried because my job, I mean, if in fact, 1 billion people can take one Coursera course, then you don't need 1 million teachers, right? Who is going to pay my salary? If all of you are going to take this one Coursera course that was recorded once a year, job security problems were happening. At that time, I decided that I'm going to shift from computer science to swimming instruction. You know why? Have you tried to learn swimming from videos? Do you understand what I'm saying? You know, I have all this, you know, YouTube videos. Why don't you learn swimming from videos? Why don't you learn bicycling from videos? Because there is no explicit knowledge about how to swim. There is no explicit knowledge about how to bicycle. So in almost what this quote unquote driving instructor versus computer science instructor, they're completely different beasts. Computer science instructor can actually give you explicit knowledge. Physics instructor can give you explicit knowledge. Driving instructor will poke you saying, don't do that, do this, don't do this, and hope for the best. Right? In fact, my driving instructor, when I first learned to drive, his greatest thing is, Rao, think of your brain as a computer. And I said, are you crazy? That's exactly what I'm trying to do. And know that it can't be done. Now you want me to think my brain is a computer and just put it on like computers, you know, greatness. But really teaching tacit knowledge tasks to other people is a very different beast than teaching explicit knowledge tasks. You guys understand that? How many of you know piano or some musical instrument, right? You know what I'm talking about. Piano is way harder than physics in terms of there is no formulas that you can mug up and be able to do piano. There's a bit of shady, like a lightweight explicit knowledge that people make up, but really that's mostly bogus, right? And you know, you do piano by doing piano. Imagine how hard it would be if I told you that you do physics by doing physics. Right? Like every one of us have to have apples falling on our heads and relearning gravity. You know, it's nonsensical. Do you see what I'm saying? So human civilization progressed because we do have explicit knowledge tasks and we can then write them up. Do you understand what I'm saying? Every generation more or less learns swimming from scratch. Every generation doesn't learn math from scratch because they have textbooks written from the previous generation. Okay, so it's a very useful thing to remember. And before going away from that, for the next point, I just want to also make this other connection called System 1 versus System 2. This is words that, the phrases, how many of you have heard System 1 versus System 2? Okay. Do you know who came up with this stuff? Name. Anybody? Kahneman and Tversky. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. They did this amazing collaboration. There's actually, of course, great books on this whole thing. One book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Fast is System 1. Slow is System 2. Okay. And some things you only know how to do fast. Like recognizing faces, either you recognize it or you don't recognize it. You don't look at the face and say, let me do some computation and figure out who I'm looking at. Do you understand what I'm saying? Some other things you do slow fast. When you multiplied 7 times 9, when you were a kid, you used your fingers. It took some number of time. Sometimes you had to, borrow other people's fingers to actually compute the answer, right? But now, eventually, you came to a point where if you're still doing this, you are in bad shape. right? What is that crazy math they talk about? Some of you have taken this math courses, the Kumon, right? Kumon math. Is that correct? Kumon math. Kumon math is trying to take explicit knowledge of math and convert it into tacit knowledge so that you feel it. Right? These numbers, you see these numbers, you know what their multiplication is. So the point about system 1, system 2 is all tacit knowledge is just system 1. Explicit knowledge tasks start as system 2 might get compiled to system 1. Do you understand that? Okay, to do things fast, you need to be able to do them without thinking. To live in a world that is not going to stay static, you need to be able to deal with new problems. And nowhere in the history, at least of the few recent lifetimes, has that been more obvious than now. Did any of us think after 1918 that we would be in this position? That everything will be closed and classrooms won't be open, and yet somehow some kind of a life is going on? We adopted. If we said class must mean being in the classroom, otherwise it's not a class, right? Which is like the system 1 way of thinking. Basically, I compiled it. That's how classes always have been. Now there's this new system, new area. I don't know what to do. When a new problem comes, system 2 essentially has to solve it. And then you might be able to compile it down to system 1. Okay, the system 1, system 2, by the way, are metaphors. There is no actual part of our brain which has this part is system 1, this part is system 2. There is no such thing. But it's a metaphor to understand how reasoning occurs. Some reasoning has always been system 1. Okay, and some starts in system 2, goes to system 1. And the things that start in system 2 are typically knowledge tasks for which you can write the know-how of the task, how to do that task. You understand all this now? Okay. Any questions?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So for spiritual intelligence, would that be considered as emotional or social? Or
correct. Quite make sense of what you said. Further?
For spiritual intelligence, do you categorize it as emotional, social, or cognitive?
You said traditional intelligence?
Spiritual.
Spiritual. I'm sorry. I don't even know how to answer that question. You mean this?
Yeah.
Really? Wow. Okay. I have no idea. Actually, I don't even know that. We are getting into deeper waters for me at any rate. I think spiritual intelligence is social intelligence. It's a shared imagination. That's my stand. You don't have to believe that. You know, that's my stand. I don't think there is any, in my list, there is no such thing called spiritual intelligence. It may very well be some, thing which has facets of social intelligence and believing in some particular social compact. Okay. I mean, if I speak more, then I will either change you into an atheist or you will change me into a, concrete theist, but let's not do that right now. Okay.
Thank you for
saying it. Yeah, sure. Any other questions? That's fine. I mean, I will basically, some of the things about these seminars is, look, these questions, I have no problem with these questions being asked, and I'll just say, if I don't think I can answer them, I'll just say that, every question is fine to ask. Anything else? Okay. So understand this. So kids come, perceptual first, emotional maybe. I mean, again, I made this line up. It's not exact, but there are kind of, they feed into each other, but you never see a New York Times article saying the kid is able to recognize his mother as well as his dad. No such thing. On the other hand, this 2-year-old kid can do multiplication. Oh my God, stop presses. Right? Because you expect 2-year-old kids not to figure out multiplication yet. You never say, New York Times never says, these two 2-year-old kids were left in the room and they didn't kill each other. Oh my God, no such thing. Because people know how to get along even when they're kids. It's in fact, we have to unlearn that and kill each other when we grow up more, okay? We are not surprised at that. Whereas we say, oh my God, these two kids were left in a room and they basically did integration by parts. 2-year-old kids. Like life is not hard enough for the rest of us. That will be New York Times article. It's not because one is harder than the other. It is because you expect people to do this later than this. You understood that now, right? That is the game that I'm playing right now. It's not necessarily that integration by parts is harder than seeing people's faces. In fact, in a minute, and if you read that article, you know that AI was doing integration by parts way before it could recognize faces. That's the punchline that I'm going to get to in a minute. So it's not because one is harder versus easier, it's just different kinds of tasks. And human kids tend to get them in a different order. And so you think the things that you learn later in life is somehow harder. Okay. Okay, some news articles here. As the demand for AI experts rises, more and more colleges and universities are offering courses and curriculums in the discipline. MIT, Stanford, Carnegie Mellon, for example, offer doctoral programs. A fairly new development is that companies involved in high technology industries and services are offering AI training seminars. Do-it-yourself technocrats should soon be teaching themselves AI fundamentals so they can design their own AI systems. This is from New York Times. Another New York Times article. In expert systems, as in robotics and computer applications in general, a common fear is that people will be replaced, job loss. Once Mr. Smith retires from General Electric, for example, he will still be available in the form of CATS 1. Therefore, why expect someone else to grow into his position? This looks like straight from the news articles, except, and so here is another one. Some at the Phoenix conference suggested, only half in jest, that software makers will eventually package their programs like detergent, new and improved with AI. Ripped from the headlines. Ripped from the headlines of 1980s. These are all from New York Times archive. Okay, this is from 1980s when AI was big in the news. How many of you were born in 1980s? Presumably not too many, maybe none. 1980s, these articles were being written and, you know, most of you more or less, except for maybe that word like expert systems that some of you may have recognized, you can't tell that these are not from today's press. So apparently there was AI before last 3-4 years when you figured it out that there is this thing called AI. What was AI doing then? It turns out that AI's progress towards intelligence essentially was in 80s. By 80s, we had these things called expert systems, which are rule-based systems, you know, that sort of describe the way the businesses do their, you know, decisions. And again, this is for explicit knowledge, right? So if you have rules, that means you are able to write the rules. That means you have explicit knowledge. Okay. And then this was like a big business at that time. Everybody will get somebody to talk to the people in the company, write like, you know, set of rules and procedures they follow. And then they'll have like an engine which will then change these rules to reach conclusions in novel scenarios. So in fact, that previous set of headlines were about these kinds of systems. Okay. In 90s, these expert systems are kind of reasoning systems, but they use this idea called rule-based systems. You know, the theoretical basis was not as clean. By 1990s, we have actually much better reasoning systems of the kind we almost have now. Okay. In fact, there was this program called Deep Blue. How many of you have heard of Deep Blue? Okay. Deep Blue essentially beat Kasparov, who was the grandmaster, who was basically the champion of the, the world champion chess. And so until then, for strange reasons, people used to think chess is connected to intelligence. And as somebody who can't play chess, if his life depended on it, I know for sure that it's not connected to anything like intelligence. It's just some random combinatoric game. And I'm not saying because of bitterness. It's really true, because if I can't do it, then it can't be intelligence. But anyway, more seriously, Deep Blue dethroned Kasparov. People somehow thought chess was intelligence. Now, this is an interesting thing. Notice that even when people started thinking about making computers intelligent, they didn't think of, we will make computers see faces and recognize them. Because every little kid can do it. You don't need computers to do that. Whereas chess, on the other hand, even Rao can't play. So if you can get a computer to play chess, that's like real intelligence. It's a bias in the way we look at what is intelligence versus not intelligence. But in fact, reasoning systems that dethroned Kasparov came in 90s, and they were explicit knowledge systems. Chess is an explicit knowledge game. You actually have rules of chess, and you search over the applications of rules to figure out what the best move is. And in fact, one of the most interesting things is, how many of you know AlphaGo? And AlphaGo has a variation called Alpha Chess. And to some extent, the difference between Alpha Chess and Deep Blue is Deep Blue was solving chess as the sort of a system one way. Alpha Chess compiles the system one way of solving chess into, I'm sorry, Deep Blue was doing it in system two way. It basically computes, the best move. Alpha Chess essentially memorizes, to put it crudely, memorizes, if the board is like this, this is the best move. Such a table would be extremely large. You don't learn chess by learning that table. How you learn chess is you learn the rules of the chess, you start playing chess games, and then you slowly compile your system 2 knowledge into system 1 reactive behavior, where you see, you do. You understand what I'm saying? And the real difference between Deep Blue and Alpha Chess is that Deep Blue was solving chess, which is an explicit knowledge game, which can actually be solved with explicit knowledge deliberately, but it's just making it more efficient by solving it reflexively, by training itself to remember most of the policy in an efficient way. Okay, that was the real difference between AlphaGo and Alpha Chess. Okay, while all of this was going on, when Deep Blue was playing and creaming Kasparov in chess, it did not know how to recognize a piece. It certainly did not know how to hold a piece. So if you go back and look at on YouTube, a Deep Blue Kasparov match, you will see that there was a human sitting on the other side of Kasparov. And the human will be told what the move is. And the human is essentially the hands. And the human basically also, there is like a camera, so there is a way of telling what the game position is. So human works as the sensor and effector, and the computer is the brain. I don't know whether this is better or worse than Matrix, if we become the hands and, hands and eyes for computers. But that's what they were doing, because the stupid computer didn't know how to pick up a piece. And it certainly didn't know how to recognize it. Mind-blowing, because we assume the other thing is true intelligence. Whereas picking a piece, I pick pieces, by the way. I mean, even though I said I'm not good at chess, I can pick chess pieces exquisitely well. Okay, nobody gave me any badge for that, right? That's because we realize that everybody does it. Okay, what all of us can do, we basically consider it's not important. The things that some of us can do better than others suddenly become more important. Okay, how many of you, in a strange way, have gone to Sonoran Museum in Tucson? Wow, there you go, good. Sonoran Museum. So do you remember there is the last time I went there like 20 years back or something, they had a huge globe, a metal globe, pretty big one, okay? And it is to scale. And they say you can kind of rub your hands over the globe. Now, when you think of Earth, typically you think of all the highs and lows, and there'll be Himalayas. So when you run over your hands over Himalayas, it should poke you, even though it's a globe, right? When you do this, you can barely tell the difference that they were Himalayas. Because with respect to the radius of the Earth, the 29,000 additional feet of Himalayas is nothing. And yet, for the bozos like us who are sitting on the surface of Earth, it looks, oh my God, mighty Everest, mighty Four Peaks, mighty, Superstition Mountains. It's the same thing with humans. General intelligence, just the general, to be even able to call yourself a functioning human being, you're already at the surface of the intelligence Earth. Since all of us can do it, we won't impress with each other. I can do it too. And then you will be able to do some funny thing that I can't do. Then you can make a TikTok video and we'll all watch it because none of us can do it. Whereas I make a TikTok video about me holding chess pieces, nobody watches it because everybody can do it. It's important to understand why we associate. This is the usual economics, right? Basically, the things that only you can do, other people can't do, suddenly become more important. Even if in fact they don't have any intrinsic advantage of being able to do that, or it's not necessarily intrinsically hard. It's just that you can do it. Some people can touch their noses with their tongues. There are not too many jobs, but I'm sure TikTok videos are definitely a possibility, right? So I want you to understand that just to call yourself humans, you're on this huge intelligence Earth on the surface. Okay, and we basically look at that as the baseline and start thinking about what intelligence is, which messes us up in figuring out what is hard versus easy. Okay, so until 2000s and later on, we did not actually do much in terms of perceptual tasks. We couldn't recognize, people couldn't recognize pictures. I mean, not people, I'm sorry, people could. Machines couldn't recognize pictures. Machines couldn't recognize speech. Despite my groundbreaking 1983 thesis on isolated word speech recognition, for the longest time, you don't talk to computers and expect to be even recognition of your words to be correct. Nowadays, much better, but for the longest time in the middle, they won't work well. Do you understand what I'm saying? The stuff that everybody could do, computers couldn't do. The stuff very few people could do, computers could do. That is essentially what happened. So if you look at how, so in 2000s is when perceptual intelligence tasks you were able to actually deal with it with computers. So you notice that humans sort of go this way and computers went this way. The AI, getting computers to show intelligence went in the opposite direction. It's strange. But it's not strange if you understand the difference between tacit versus explicit knowledge tasks. I can teach you what I know explicitly how I do. Do you understand what I'm saying? So if it's an explicit knowledge task, I can teach you. Instead of teaching you, in fact, there is this old thing called I see, I hear, I kind of understand, I read, I understand more. I understand really well. And you add to that, I program, I truly understand. Because to be able to program a computer to do a task, you need to have understood how to do that task explicitly and correctly. If you are a computer science person, you'll be taking algorithms courses, for example. So an algorithm for sorting, it's an explicit knowledge task. How to sort a sequence of numbers fastest way possible such that they are going from largest to smallest. Okay, that's an explicit knowledge task. And you don't say, I feel this thing is sorted enough. You actually need to know what the algorithm for sorting is, and you need to write it as code for the computer. So the things that you can get computers to do fast are the things that you know how to do explicitly. If you didn't know how to do it, how could you tell computers? For most of the time, what happened now? It doesn't want to go further. What happened? Let's see. Oh, maybe there's a thing. I may have to change the screen in a minute. For most of the time, we basically, when we talked about getting computers to do anything, we talked about getting computers to do things that we understand how to do. We just want them to do it faster than us. When I say we, it doesn't have to be all of you. For example, you guys don't know all the efficient sorting algorithms, but you take a few courses, you will. Courses are explicit knowledge. That's what we did first. Whereas, how do I teach you how to recognize a cat? What is a cat? What is raw? How do you recognize raw? I don't know. I can't write any rules. Any set of rules I write, they're all very wishy-washy. Okay? And so then what happens then is that you have to go back to teaching computers the way you learned. How did you learn how to recognize people's faces? Which class did you take? Was that CSE 101 or Math 103? No. You learned before you ever went to school. You learned just by observation. With a little push from evolution, you had brain circuitry, which was sort of ready to look at everything and see it as a face. And then all that was needed then is people being around you. They don't even need to come and, all this nonsense about, I showed you this, the woman putting Mozart tapes to the kid in the womb, or maybe teaching bubble sort algorithms for kids. It's like, they don't really work. What really works is kids at that point are just looking at behavior and trying to learn from examples. And they learn from examples subconsciously. Do you understand what I'm saying? This is where learning comes in. In fact, you never really say, even though we say I'm learning in computer science, mostly what you're doing is reading up stuff that people have written and basically applying it to new situations. The true kind of learning of the thing that, computers that, recognize pictures, etc. do is being shown a gazillion pictures of cats versus dogs versus something else. And saying, this is a cat, this is not a cat, this is a cat, this is a dog, this is something else. And then letting computer figure out how, when you show a new picture, whether it's a cat or not. It's a much, much, much more inefficient learning because it requires a lot of data. Lots of examples. In fact, human kids really, if human kids learn the way computers learn, they still won't be able to recognize anything. So there are certain things that we don't know how human learning works. But at least what they're doing is learning from examples. And to get to perceptual tasks, get to manipulation tasks for which we didn't have explicit knowledge. We couldn't depend on writing programs because we didn't know how to do the task ourselves. We just knew example, label, example, label. So this is a raw, this is a cat, this is a dog. And do learning. Okay, let me see why this thing isn't working. Actually, I will see 1 second. Maybe it is. I'm going to just change my, I don't know why this happened. I'm going to change the, okay. Oh, then, oh, so I think, okay. Ah, good, okay. So this is where we were. Of course, you know, for some strange reason, my PowerPoint lost its license. So all the nice things I wrote on it are gone now, but they're on the recording. Okay, so, but that's fine. So this idea as to why AI systems went this way, whereas the humans went this other way, by now you kind of understand, because I've been, you know, belaboring this point, both by making you read that article and now this real long elaboration of explicit versus tacit tasks. So I can just sort of read this. Why did AI develop in this reverse way? It is easier to program computers and aspects of intelligence for which we have conscious theories. In fact, there is this idea called Polany's paradox. Polany's paradox basically said what I was telling you, which is we tended, science and human civilization tended to glorify explicit knowledge tasks. Chess was considered intelligence. Holding a chess piece was considered pedestrian. Okay, multiplication was considered intelligent. Seeing people's faces and recognizing them was considered pedestrian because everybody could do it. And to some extent, Polany was arguing that all the tacit knowledge tasks, no, they don't get any love from science because people are too busy writing books. You can't write a book on swimming. I don't know. Have you seen many, many books on swimming? I mean, we've been swimming forever. How come there are like no swimming volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, advanced swimming for beginners, all that stuff? Whereas there are like 1 million such books on algorithms. Because in the end, ultimately, swimming is something where we don't have any explicit knowledge. We have to just learn from example. Do you understand what I'm saying? So our human language is not good enough to write what we have about it. Or at least we are not, it's not consciously accessible. So the original programs we were doing were, of course, the ones of which we had explicit knowledge. We are not particularly conscious of perceptual or manipulative intelligence. Manipulative, again, the physical manipulation. How do we hold things and so on? We are not conscious of it. We do it, but we don't know how to do it. You see what I'm saying? And so we had to depend on making the machines learn the way we had to, which is learning from data and demonstrations. Now, why is that a problem? Why can't you just have data? I mean, you guys are all basically, you know, in this new age where everything is data, etc. But believe it or not, there was a time when all of computer vision was based on this one picture. This is Lena, a Swedish model. Look it up on Wikipedia. Somebody basically, it's unfortunately, so they basically found this picture. I believe apparently it was a Playboy centerfold. And then they essentially scanned it and took this piece, and it became the benchmark for testing all computer vision algorithms. If you see, computer vision as a field existed since 1950s. If you see most of the papers until up to even 1980s, if you randomly pick a computer vision paper and from image processing computer vision paper, you'll see this picture. And this poor woman didn't even know that she was doing this public service for a bunch of computer vision dweebs. And there is a very famous conference, it's become famous now, called CVPR, Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition Conference. And at one point of time, I think several years back, Computer Vision and Pattern Recognition Conference people invited Lena to come to the conference so that they can see this picture that they're using to kind of use as a benchmark as in real flesh and blood, three-dimensional real person. She was the artist's model in some sense for computer vision. Why is that? Even as I'm speaking, I'm sure some of you are sending extra pictures of what is going on, in your life to your friends. That's because cell phones have become cameras. Originally, cell phones were supposed to be phones. But really, we buy cell phones in terms of their camera capabilities now. And we take pictures, we record everything. In general, if you are not sure, assume that you're being recorded in the current world. This is your world, okay? In this world that you live in, ImageNet, which is an academic database of pictures, has 14 million pictures. And you are not fazed by it. Because you can imagine on a good weekend, you can make 1 million pictures yourself with your cell phone, especially if there's a cute cat around, why not? It's just, do multiple pictures and then there's an upload button, it goes off in the, Google Drives of the world. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it's not that cats didn't exist before. Cats existed before. Cute cats also existed before. But the data wasn't being captured and made available in a form that computers can be trained on. You take this for granted now, but it wasn't possible until very, very recently. Okay, so in fact, why did AI catch public imagination right now? If you come back to this, early AI was a blind and deaf Socrates. It's like, some elitism made us think that chess is the great mark of intelligence. Deep Blue won chess. Yeah, that was there. So one day there was like New York Times headlines and everything. Next day you went back to your normal life. Because who has this desperate need for a chess program that can defeat Kasparov? Would you buy it from me if I were to sell it to you? If I put it on Apple apps or something, would you buy it? Who cares? That's done. It's over. There's nothing you could do with this, even though we consider that to be the hallmark of intelligence. It's really the stuff, that pedestrian stuff that we take for granted, recognizing faces, recognizing voices, recognizing text, for which nobody thought that was like hallmark of intelligence in any way, that because we do all of it ourselves, that is a lot more useful because it's basically, especially connected with your cell phone now. You can show your cell phone the picture, and if apparently there are people who can't recognize cats, so they can show the cell phone a cat and it's a cell phone, what is it? And it's a cat. There you go. And even if you recognize cats, if you're a birder, ornithologist or something, and you take a picture of a bird, the cell phone can say, this is red-winged, fat-lipped, ostrich or something. Okay, so, and you will be very impressed that, okay, I now have a name for this. This is what I'm saying. This has become very useful technology, even though it's something that nobody cared about in the beginning. So our cell phones and our Alexas, the perceptual abilities are there. And now people suddenly see, now by this time, people started saying being able to see the world is intelligence. Even though actually originally we used to consider that to be not intelligence at all, because everybody does it, what's the big deal about it? Now you know, now you're a believer. Now you realize that, who cares about a chess playing program? Who cares even about a Go playing program? This stuff, this low level stuff is quite useful. And then we can build up from there. So that is the thing that we were checking out. And which also leads to many misperceptions in public. We'll talk about this, but I also want to talk about this other thing. It's a very useful point that you want to think about. despite the fact that human civilization progressed because of system 2 and explicit knowledge, we still romanticize system 1 and tacit knowledge. If you're lucky enough to have somebody that you love very much, and if that somebody asks you, tell me why you love me, I'm giving you useful advice. Don't write list saying number 1, because your skin tone is 85% gray. Number 2, because your English sentences are 15 words long. These kinds of falsifiable hypotheses you don't want to use, because if you do this, if somebody tells you they like you because your hair is exactly 17 centimeters long, you are not impressed. You want to be liked for some basically non-verbalizable reasons. All of Hollywood, after this you can do rom-com movies, right? In the rom-com movie, there is never any list saying this is the explicit knowledge of why I like you. The answer when somebody asks you why you like them or you love them, it's your whole you. Nothing can be, everything is just as important. It's like beyond words. It's strange because entire human civilization was putting damn things in words, putting things in explicit knowledge, and yet we romanticize tacit knowledge. So people who can answer a question without thinking, we are just a lot more impressed than people who can answer a question after thinking. This is, by the way, the other thing, right? If somebody says, do you love me? And you want to kind of hang around with them, don't say, this is a pretty tough question. It takes 15 minutes of thought. If you do that, you find somebody else, hopefully. Okay, because you essentially have to give the system 1 answer, right or wrong. Now, this has nothing to do with AI. This has nothing to do with computer science. This is just us. We romanticize tacit knowledge despite the fact that entire civilization that we built around us depended very much on explicit knowledge. Okay, and that cannot be discounted. That's other reasons why people are just impressed that computers can do things that they don't have to be taught. They just observed and picked it up. Okay. So the other thing, of course, as I already mentioned, the perceptual technology essentially depended on 2 independent developments. One is this particular kind of machine learning algorithms called neural networks that you have heard of, that they're all over the place. We'll do a little more in depth about what is involved in learning the parameters for these kinds of networks. Honestly, how many of you have done calculus 2? Okay, it turns out, do you remember differentiation? Not even integration. Which was harder in calculus, differentiation or integration?
Integration.
What?
Integration.
Integration is hard because integration is art. Because not most integrals, they don't have exact, you can't do exact integration. You have to, try various tricks. Differentiation is a science, right? Because any function that you can write in terms of elementary functions, however complex this composed function is, you'll be able to differentiate. Right? Remember that, point 1. Point 2, do you remember that in using differentiation, if I give you a function, you can find its local maxima and minima. What is local maxima and minima? Wherever the derivative is equal to 0, that means the tangent is horizontal, that is either a local minima or a local maxima or at least a stationary point. Like it could be like this, it could be like this, it could be like this. Much of training of things like neural networks or training of any machine learning algorithm we will see is nothing but finding minima of a multi-dimensional function, multi-variable function. Okay, so if you essentially have a function f of x1, etc., up to xn, I'm trying to find the place where this function reaches a minimum value or a maximum value. Most of the time, if it's error, you're trying to minimize the error. And to do the minimization, the idea is simple. You know, for the single variable, you remember, right? Essentially, you look for the points where the derivative is 0. Then it is either minimum or a maximum. Then you take the second derivative. Yes, remember this stuff from high school? Many of you are actually, in fact, the problem for 471 Intro to AI is many of them come into computer science and forget all the calculus because you don't use, at least in computer science, unfortunately, more of the traditional computer science uses discrete mathematics. The stuff that you did before calculus in high school, the finite math. And calculus is not used much. Whereas if you take any other area like mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, they basically start off where you left off in high school and they'll continue doing more calculus because continuous functions is what they deal with in terms of the use of math, right? And so for single variables, finding single variable functions, finding a derivative and finding a second derivative test, that's how you find the minimum and maximum, right? And if you cannot actually find the places where derivative becomes 0, because a derivative can be an arbitrarily complex function in itself, finding where it becomes 0 involves solving arbitrarily hard equations. We may not be able to do that. So there is this other idea that you call, basically Newton-Raphson method, where you see that when you are at a point, if you want to find where the function is at 0, you can take the tangent at that point, see where the tangent cuts the x-axis, and that will be the new place for your new guess as to where this function is crossing 0. And you can do this iteratively to find function crossings, function 0 crossings. And finding maxima minima is just finding 0 crossings except for derivatives. So all of machine learning really is right now, mostly in terms of the math behind it, is multivariable calculus gradient descent, because Newton-Raphson method basically takes the gradient and goes in the direction opposite to the gradient. And in a multivariable function, you don't have a single differential, you have partial differentials. That means you have a vector of derivatives and you take a small step in the direction opposite to the derivatives, the vector of the derivatives, and then check again. And you keep doing this until you reach a place where, basically the derivative becomes 0. And then when the derivative becomes 0, what happens is you no longer move because the derivative the derivative vector becomes 0 magnitude. So you don't have much movement anymore and you realize that's where you are. This is how you, by the way, reach the top of a mountain if you don't know how the mountain is supposed to look. Okay, how many of you have seen, for example, things like Mount Whitney? How many of you have gone up Mount Whitney? There are many of these mountains where they're not like this classic Zermatt, where the entire mountain nicely peaks up and you can see where the top of the mountain is. Many mountains sort of, go up, come down, go up, and sort of. And then so the only way you can figure out you've reached the mountain's top is when you start making small steps, your elevation is reducing. But then that is a local minimum. It's not a global minimum. So in fact, Mount Whitney is a hard mountain to climb by that metric, because most of the mountains in front of it in the foreground look much more imposing than Mount Whitney. So to actually reach the continental United States high point, you need to climb those mountains, come down and go up on the other one. And these are basically called hill climbing methods. And that's what you wind up doing in computing these minimums for these functions. That's one part. We'll talk a little more about that later. I just wanted to say there's not too much magic. It's just calculus, except in steroids. Not even integral calculus, just differential calculus. Right? So easy. Second is data being freely captured and made available. That is something that AI people didn't do anything. It just happened. It's not like someday, you know, as people were looking at Lena's picture, they weren't thinking, maybe we need more models. They were not thinking this. They were just trying to work on the one picture that was available, more or less. So they were not actually deliberately planning to increase the amount of data being captured. That revolution occurred in a completely orthogonal fashion. Right? Web. I mean, I can take credit for everything when AI people can take credit for everything, but really not, right? A web happened, and then cell phones happened. And then cell phones started taking pictures and recording anything anywhere. And then they were put on the web. Now the infrastructure was available. Infrastructure was available to basically allow everything that we did. If I can make this clear, if you can see this. How many of you heard of the name Carl Jung? There are some psychology people. That's good. Carl Jung talked about collective unconscious. Web has become our collective subconscious. Every damn thing that you guys record, basically before you even know, Google and Apple uploading it onto the web. You understand what I'm saying? It's all data on which learning algorithms can be run. And they learn patterns from that. You may not have decided to say, this is something that I want to be known for. And this actually winds up having a big issue. So the fact that web is a collective subconscious meant data problem is now solved, because people are just producing data and uploading it freely. You didn't have to do anything. And the AI guy, just have to exploit it using more or less at a caricature level, high quality math like differential calculus and finding function minimas. Okay, this is very anticlimactic. It would be much nicer if I could tell you a story that, and then AI found the solution. There is no such thing. In fact, the things that you call neural networks, these things that I'm showing you, oh my God, it's just every once in a while it does this. I have to do this again. The neural networks that I talked to you about, these kinds of things, the first ideas for these came in 1962, the year I was born, by a guy called Frank Rosenblatt. He called them perceptrons. They were the first small kinds of neural networks. They just happened to be neural networks which just have one layer, output layer and then input layer. That's it. Only that much is the network. And it turns out that those networks learn some things, but not everything. And the fact that they couldn't learn everything wound up being used against them. There is politics in science too. And that area got buried. And then it got rediscovered in 1980s. Around the same time when Deep Blue was occurring, neural networks had the second coming. Then they had the multiple layers. Then they figured out that really what we are doing is multivariable function minimization. Then they went back and checked their calculus 2 textbooks and figured out how to do this. But the problem were two parts. One is the way these things are trained is you show, let's say, the picture of the dog here and let the neural network say what it thinks the class of this picture is. And then you actually compare it to the correct class, take the error, propagate it backwards. To do this, you need like gazillion pictures of cats and dogs and people and, you know, buses and random other things. They had like 5 or 7. Plus they had pretty sucky computers. It turns out that the computers, really what winds up happening, we'll see that in training these kinds of networks, individual operations that are done in each of these nodes are extremely simplistic. They're like, they add up all the inputs that are coming and then, you know, threshold it using a function and send the output out. That's it. Individual units do very little computation, but you need a huge number of such units. Another orthogonal development, for the longest time in computer science, we didn't have bitmap terminals. When I was a grad student, I used to have a nice little thing called Ann Arbor Ambassador Terminal. It's the kind of thing that you see a 1970s Hollywood movie where this, you know, letters are big and green with all these dots on them. That's the kind of machines that I used to fight for, because other people will, you know, if I don't even get that, then I have to do punched cards. And then slowly we started having bitmap terminals. And then people basically realized that there's only so much bitmapped terminals. For the bitmap terminals, what happens is when you're looking at the screen, individual pixels of the screen are have to be controlled. But the control that needs to be done is essentially setting up the brightness and the color of the pixel. If you do all of them in parallel, then suddenly what you're seeing in front of you shows up. Much of the graphics algorithms, what they do is essentially set all these pixels in parallel. And so many of you know that these are what are called GPUs, graphics processing units. NVIDIA used to be a little backwater company which started making this sort of technology. Of course, lots of other people were doing it too. Other people were doing also bigger computers, but then NVIDIA were looking for, you're making GPUs, you need additional market. And slowly they found that gamers not only want, you know, like terminals, small terminals, they want fast, you know, displays and big terminals. So they were trying to sell these GPUs to the gamers. For a while that worked, but even gamers don't need universal, you know, like a Tempe-sized screen. How many GPUs are they going to buy? Then somebody put 2 and 2 together that, look, I need to do these very silly operations on each of these nodes, for which using an entire Windows machine makes no sense. I just need a brainless small unit which can do small operations. GPUs is my thing. It's a mass of simple-brained computers. Okay, so that is the compute technology that people talk about now. It's not so much that, you know, when you're buying a laptop, etc., you look at what's the CPU speed, what is the RAM. That's not what matters anymore. If you're training these kinds of things, it matters as to the GPU size, because how big is the network that you can train depends on how many simple-minded CPUs you have, the GPUs you have. And then the third independent, and so this GPU development didn't occur in AI. It's just that once AI became big, NVIDIA said, who said we are a gaming company? We are an AI company. We always were an AI company. We were just waiting for people to realize that we are an AI company. And, you know, if you guys get some money and if you invest in NVIDIA, especially a couple of years back, you would be quite rich, because they suddenly became like a huge success story. And the third is this data thing that I was telling you. Humongous amount of data can be captured and put in a form that can be used for training. This was required for learning from data, where we don't have how to identify a cat, we don't know how to identify a dog, okay? And similarly, we don't know how to read text. And so all of these, so actually, I mean, we can talk about this later, it's already 4 o'clock, but because of this, this sort of training, you can do simple image recognition. You can actually, once you can recognize images, you can imagine images. In fact, there's this whole entire issue of, do kids dream? I mean, unfortunately, kids don't write a little email saying, right now, yesterday night we had a good dream, because kids don't know how to type. Okay, so we have no idea whether or not kids are dreaming, but it's very likely that they have dreams. Okay, because as they are able to recognize the world around them, they start, imagining made up words. That's what your dreams are. Okay, and so machines can now do this sort of a thing. They can generate, images. It's very surprising that you can do this. In fact, these are all essentially, apparently, people. They look like random Hollywood people, but apparently there is no actual Hollywood person behind this picture. This was just made out of whole cloth. This is a made up face. These are what are called deep fakes, essentially. So the idea then is, one way of thinking of learning is, the learners are trying to understand this multidimensional distribution of images. So if you have this distribution of images and you sample from this image, this distribution, you get a new image. And you learned this distribution by seeing some actual images, but there's only points. And what learning algorithm does is interpolates between them. And every intermediate point corresponds to an actual image that you just happen not to see. And this is essentially, you could do that. And so those are all made up people, apparently. And then you can make up text without understanding what the text says. GPT-3 essentially learns over some billions of files. I mean, I think 8 billion or so files, no, 8 million sentences and 8 billion parameters of the network. Now, where are these 8 million sentences coming from? Nobody sat and wrote them. It's just that we are writing everything. We're tweeting everything. We're writing everything. We are putting stuff on Reddit. And they take all of this and train the system to produce their text. Is it any surprise then that GPT-3 sometimes produces highly racist, highly sexist, highly brain dead kind of English? Because we write it ourselves. When we think nobody is looking, we'll get onto Reddit, say anon tempi 3475, and spew forth all the junk that we want to say that nobody wants to associate with us. And we are taking this, and we are training the systems, and the system is thinking, oh, maybe this is what you want me to produce. So we talk a lot about bias in AI, etc. No, this is just all bias. The problem with subconscious is, I told you that web can be thought of as this collective subconscious. The problem with subconscious is it is raw, it is unwashed, and you don't want to say it loud. Right? Like if you have kids, I'm hoping that most of you grew up in households where your parents, who knew a large number of 4-letter words, because they're human, somehow magically never used them in front of you. Of course, you learned it anyway because you went to school where the 4-letter words are the language, but at least you didn't learn them from your parents. Whereas if all the language corpora is put together, then the GPT-3 essentially, which can do all these things, it can write actual essays. In fact, a couple of weeks back, Guardian wrote, put in an open op-ed that GPT-3 produced, more or less looks like something that some reasonable human, slightly addle-headed, reasonable human has produced. Do you understand what I'm saying? You can do this. Now, people have also checked, you can ask GPT-3 saying, And then there were these two Muslim men, and then asked GPT-3 to complete the sentence. And then GPT-3 happily says, and then they went and killed the passerby. Then you ask it again. There are two Muslim men who are peaceful. And then it completes saying, and yet they went to the mosque and shot somebody. Looks ugly. You don't expect that anybody in Google and Facebook is sitting there and making programs that will spew out this kind of racist, sexist nonsense. But if you take all data and learn from it, you learn both good and bad. It's not that you don't think bad thoughts. I mean, unless you are somehow, slightly brain deficient, we think all thoughts. We filter them. Our system 2 tells us what of our system 1 to filter out. Do you understand what I'm saying? If my system 1 is talking, it will be free-flowing talk, and it will have both the good and the bad stuff. This is the other side of using data that is just available out there. Okay, I'll just stop there. Actually, I'll end with this. These are two pictures. One of them is of a real person. In fact, you can play this if you haven't played this. I think it's still there, which is whichfaceisreal.com. You can play this afterwards. One of them is a real person whose picture it is. The other doesn't exist. And the computer just made it up. Which one is which?
I think the baby's the one.
Okay, let's ask the following thing. How many people think this is real and not fake? Raise your hands. Okay, 3 people or 4 people think this is real. How many people think this is real and not fake? So more of you think this is real. In this actually particular case, I don't quite know how you reach that conclusion. In this particular case, that's true. Many actually people might think that this is made up and this is real, because this thing looks like a real person and this has all sorts of random, giraffe legs sprouting up. But that's just because the little girl was holding the giraffe legs, for crying out loud. A giraffe, and then the legs were showing up. The fact that you couldn't right away be sure. This is already 2-year-old, 1.5-year-old technology. So you can think of which world you are inhabiting now, where you see a picture, it doesn't mean that it corresponds to a person. It could be an imagined person. Okay. I actually will just stop there. Yeah. What I want to do, I guess, what I would have done, maybe that's something that we're going to do next is, is everything done in AI? And actually, one of the things I might ask is, let me see if I can get you this. Actually, let me ask this question. Yeah. This is the last question I ask you. Okay. So Explorer Magellan went around the world 3 times. One of those trips, Magellan died. Okay, got the premise. Question, which trip did Magellan die in?
Last one.
That's what I'm saying. So Explorer Magellan went around the world 3 times, and one of the trips, the Magellan died. Which trip did Magellan die in? Most of us have no trouble, because we will think the most likely answer is 3rd trip, because dead people don't go around the world. Although if you look at the Wikipedia article, it turns out that in his 3rd trip, first part he died, and they took this dead guy around the rest of the world. But nobody should be thinking between 1, 2, and 3, which one is it? But what in this problem statement told you what the answer is? How did you know the answer? You knew the answer. Is it because you have read the Magellan story on Wikipedia just before coming to the class? Is it because you have a specific piece of information that you have embedded in your head saying, if Magellan were to die, Magellan will die on the third trip? Is it because you tend to think that the explorers, if they die on the third trip? What do you know that made you realize that in this case, Magellan died on third trip without thinking?
Wasn't a fourth trip.
But there was no fourth trip, I understand. But we also assume that we don't talk about trips for dead people unless you believe in some kind of afterlife, right? So if he's dead, then he must have been dead in the third trip, because if he's dead in the second trip, where is the third trip coming from? Exactly how active is this guy's social life after he's dead? This is common sense. Once again, you don't get badges for answering this question. If you have trouble answering this question, you probably need psychiatric examination. Most computers can't deal with this sort of stuff. That's like one thing. For example, common sense is something that we still do not have AI systems capable of handling. I'll just stop there and we'll talk about other things later on, but common sense is like a big goal that we still don't have. We ran out of time, so not too many questions, and I'm hoping next time it'll be different. Okay. I cannot believe that you just came to listen to me for 2 hours. As I said, I can talk to you for any number of hours. I love the sound of my voice, especially because I have this beautiful Blue Yeti microphone. So I know I must be sounding really, really good. But that's not the point. So my hope is next time we'll start. Actually, first of all, you should be doing this, summary of the lecture thing. I will send you, and then you should be doing that. And then if there are any questions, you can do it on the Piazza. And the next time we'll talk more, about your questions first before I do any presentation. Fine? Okay. Have a good weekend, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.